In 1879 Colorado, the mining town laughed when 17-year-old Anika Ross built her winter home from mud and straw. Guided by an ancestral journal, she engineered a subterranean kiva for its thermal mass, while the settlers mocked her dirt pie. Then the historic Christmas blizzard struck, shattering their log cabins with apocalyptic cold. As the temperature plummeted and the wind screamed, the only warm sanctuary left was Anika's cob, walled refuge, and the very skeptics who scorned her, including the town's leader Elias Thorne, stumbled through the white hell to pound on her door, begging for salvation. The Colorado Rockies held their breath in the autumn of 1879, a silence so deep it felt like a warning. For 17-year-old Anika Ross, the silence in her own soul was louder. Orphaned 2 winters prior, when a fever swept through the remote silver camp of Argent's Hope, her inheritance was a plaid, outclaimed shack on a windy ridge, and the steadfast companionship of Kip, a shepherd mix with one alert ear perpetually cocked and eyes the color of old amber. Her parents' true legacy, however, was a sea chest from her mother's side, containing a treasure more valuable than any silver vein, the journals of her great-grandfather, Alonzo, an engineer who had traveled the Andes. The shack, a thing of warped timber and yawning chinks, was a sieve for the coming cold. As the first aspen leaves turned gold, Anika found herself poring over Alonzo's smallest, most want about mining. It was a study of indigenous homes. One passage, dated 1823, burned itself into her mind. Observe the construction of a kiva in a high-altitude village. Subterranean, circular, entered by ladder through the roof. The villagers explained the earth is a blanket. The sun heats the stone floor by day. The stone whispers the warmth back by night. The thick walls of adobe, clay and straw are not just walls. They are a battery for the sun. They call it thermal mass. The cold air, being heavier, stays in the sunken floor, leaving the sleeping platform warm. It is not fighting the mountain's cold, but borrowing from its own deep, constant heart. A postscript, added later Reedy, could such a principle of sinking into the earth and storing heat work in a Rocky Mountain winter? The clay here is different, the cold more dry. But the physics of sun and stone are universal. The genius idea was born of necessity and cross-continental wisdom. She would not build up against the wind. She would build in, embracing the earth's insulation. But Colorado stone was cumbersome, and she had no quarry. Her innovation was under her feet, the dense iron, red clay of her ridge, and the endless stands of lodgepole pine. Her project would be a hybrid, a semi-subterranean structure based on the kiva's principles, but built with cob, a mixture of clay, sand and straw, formed into monolithic walls. Cob had immense thermal mass. It would absorb the weak winter sun through a south-facing opening and radiate it for hours. Its thickness and the straw within would create millions of tiny air gaps, a perfect insulator. She would dig into the south face of her ridge, creating an earthen berm on 3 sides, and build a circular cob wall, capped with a sod roof. The conflict began with the first shovelful. Her tools were a pickaxe, a spade, a borrowed wheelbarrow with a wobbly wheel, and a homemade cobber's fork, essentially a heavy stick. The excavation was back-breaking. The ridge soil was a tangled mat of roots and stubborn clay. Each swing of the pick was a negotiation, each lift of the spade a test of will. Kip would watch, head tilted, then dig furiously beside her in a frenzy of misguided help, sending arcs of dirt flying. She harvested clay from a seep near the creek, hauling buckets up the steep path until her shoulders screamed. She cut tall grass for straw, her palms blistering against the scythe's rough handle. Mixing the cob was the most brutal labor. She created a pit on a tarp, combining clay, sand, and straw, then added water. There was no ox to tread it. She removed her boots and stockings, and with Kip barking in excitement, danced the mixture with her bare feet, churning it with the fork. The coarse mixture scraped her skin. The mountain air, even in autumn, chilled the wet clay, turning her feet numb and blue. Her hands, from hauling, cutting, and mixing, became a landscape of torn cuticles and cracks that wept and stung. The settlement of Argent's Hope learned of her work when the supply wagon, led by the grizzled ex-miner and town factotum, Elias Thorne, came by. Thorne was a man who believed in what he could see, heft and assay. He found Anika up to her knees in a pit of mud and straw, her skirt curled up, her face and arms splattered with red clay. "Ross girl," he called, his voice a gravelly rumble. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, digging a new privy, a mite ambitious for one. Anika straightened, wiping her forehead with a clay-caked wrist. "It's not a privy, Mr. Thorne. It's a house." Thorne stepped closer, peering into the excavated dish in the hillside, the beginnings of a curved, mud-colored wall. He let out a short, incredulous bark of laughter. "Hey, house of mud, Lord above child, have the vapors taken you? This is mountain country. We build with timber, with stone, things that stand firm." He kicked at a drying cob brick. This is what swallows build. It'll melt with the first hard rain. Wash right down the hill and you with it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "When it dries, it's hard as rock. Harder. The straw holds it together. The earth around it will protect it. Protect it." Thorn scoffed, his face a mask of paternal disappointment. "Your pa was a good miner. Your ma was a fine woman. This is a disgrace to their memory, playing in mud like a child when winter's at the door. A proper log cabin chinked tight with a stone hearth. That's what honors a pioneer. This?" He shook his head. "This is foolishness. You'll freeze in a dirt pile." He left the wagon creaking away. The story reached Argent's Hope before dusk. At the Mercantile, Anika became the mud dauber. Women clucked, men shook their heads. Her project was proof of a fragile mind, a girl broken by loss and altitude. Yet, as the aspens shed their gold, her kiva rose. The circular wall grew foot by foot, hand-sculpted thicker at the base. She formed a narrow tunnel-like entrance facing south, to block the north wind but admit the low winter sun. She embedded stones for a hearth against the inner wall. For a roof, she laid pine poles across the open circle, then a layer of canvas tarpaulin, and finally, a foot of sod cut from the hillside above. It looked, to a scornful eye, like a sudden, grassy hobbit hole erupting from the ridge. The final confrontation came as she was collecting the last loads of sod. Thorn returned with 2 other miners. His patience had evaporated. "Last chance, girl," he stated. "No pity left, only blunt force. You abandon this burrow and come work at the boarding house in town for the winter. This is not a suggestion. You will die here." Anika stood a sod brick heavy in her arms. "The tests in my great-grandfather's journal?" "To hell with his journal!" Thorn roared, his voice echoing off the ridge. "This is the real world. That mud will crack. The roof will leak. The cold will seep up from the ground and turn your bones to ice. It is simple fact." He pointed a thick finger at her. "You are choosing pride over life. We will not dig you out come spring." The men behind him nodded, their faces solemn. They saw themselves as rescuers of a stubborn soul. That night, the first hard frost silvered the valley. Anika moved her bedroll and kip inside the finished kiva. She lit a small fire in the new hearth. The smoke drew cleanly up through a chimney pipe, fitted through the sod roof. The change was profound. The howl of the wind across the ridge became a distant murmur. The fire's heat did not vanish up a drafty chimney, but was absorbed by the thick cob walls. The air inside was still, heavy, and carried the scent of earth and pine. Kip, who in the shack would shiver and press close, circled once on the packed earthen floor and lay down with a contented groan. Anika placed her palm against the wall. It was cool, but not cold. It felt alive, holding the day's final sun and the fire's gentle offering within its dense, straw-shot matrix. The physics, ancient and borrowed, worked. But outside, the community's judgment was final. She was the mad girl in the mud hill. And high in the peaks, the first true snows began to gather, brewing the storm that would test every principle Alonzo had recorded and Anika had faith in, the storm known as the Christmas blizzard of 1879. The mockery in Argent's Hope did not fade, it calcified into accepted truth. Anika Ross was no longer just an orphan, but the mud girl, a living cautionary tale. Her kiva, visible from the main trail as a strange, grassy pimple on the ridge, became a landmark for folly. Elias Thorn, having issued his warning, now felt a grim responsibility to witness her inevitable failure. He made a point of riding past her claim every week, a self-appointed auditor of disaster. He'd watch from a distance as she worked, a solitary figure against the vast mountainscape, and report back at the saloon. Still patching her dirt pie, he'd grumble into his beer. "Shen her hauling water. That wall will crack before Christmas, mark me. Then we'll have to go fetch her." Half frozen and finally sensible, the community's dismissal was a wall as palpable as the one she was building. At the Mercantile, when she came to trade eggs for salt and nails, a cold silence would follow her entry. Conversations resumed only after she left, now tinged with a sharp, righteous pity. "Poor creature," Mrs. Gunderson, the Mercantile owner's wife, would sigh. "It's a sin to let a young girl live like that. Thorn should put his foot down." Their judgment was a social chinking sealing her out. This rejection only drove Anika deeper into the meticulous science of her work. The conflict was no longer between her and Thorn. It was between the empirical wisdom in Alonzo's journal and the entire tactile, hard-won experience of the mining camp. Every shake of her head was a challenge to her physics. The brutal physical toll escalated as autumn sharpened into early winter. The clay, once pliable, now froze overnight. She had to break a skin of ice on her mixing pit every morning. Hauling water from the creek became a treacherous ordeal on frost-slicked paths. Her bare feet could no longer endure the icy slurry. She was forced to mix the cob with her hands and the fork, the cold leaching through her leather gloves until her fingers burned with a deep, aching numbness. The cracks on her hands, never given time to heal, became red, painful fissures. She took to coating them in pine sap and beeswax at night, a poor balm against the relentless labor. Kip was her barometer and her comfort. He learned to lie on the tarp, his body heat helping to keep the mixing pit from freezing solid. He would bark sharply at the approach of strangers, his growl a low, protective rumble that echoed in the kiva's shell. Her focus turned to perfection. The genius of cob was its monolithic nature, no seams for the cold to needle through, but it had to dry evenly to avoid cracks. She built slowly in lifts, allowing each 2-foot layer to cure for days before adding the next. She used stones to form a tight, radiating circle for the hearth, ensuring maximum contact with the cob wall's thermal mass. The south-facing entrance tunnel she shaped like a baffle, a right-angle turn to keep out direct wind but admit diffuse light. She calculated the roof pitch meticulously, so snow would slide off the sod layer rather than accumulate. It was this very roof that became the flashpoint for Elias Thorne's final, public condemnation. A week before Thanksgiving, a wet, heavy snow fell, draping the mountains in a silent blanket. Thorne, with 2 other councilmen in tow, rode up to find Anika on her roof, carefully brushing accumulated snow from the sod with a pine buff broom. "Ross," Thorne bellowed, dismounting, "get down from there before you fall through that muck and break your neck." Anika climbed down, her face calm. "The snow is heavy. It needs to be lightened or it will compress the sod and risk a leak." "A leak?" One of the councilmen, a carpenter named Higgins, laughed. "Girl, that whole thing is a leak waiting to happen. You think mud and grass will keep out a Rocky Mountain winter? It's not a house, it's a wishing well." Thorne stepped forward. "Enough. This is the last time I'll ask nicely. Come down to town. Now, Higgins has a room above his shop. This experiment is over. The first real cold snap will turn this kiva of yours into a crypt." He used the word deliberately, having heard it from her journal. "It's not an experiment," Anika said, her voice low but clear. "The cob is dry. It's harder than the mortar in your chimney. The earth around it is already insulating. The cold snap will prove it." "Prove it?" Thorne's face darkened with frustration.
"What are you, a schoolmom? This isn't about proofs. It's about not dying. Your wall is dirt. Dirt gets cold.
"It's simple." "It's not simple." She fired back, a spark of defiance finally igniting. "The dirt has mass. It soaks up the heat from the sun through the doorway and from the fire. It holds that heat and lets it out slow, like a banked coal. That's thermal mass. The straw inside it traps tiny pockets of air. Still air is the best insulator there is. It's not just dirt." She grasped for Alonzo's word, "a battery." For warmth. Her speech, a torrent of foreign concepts, left the men staring. To them, a battery was a thing for telegraphs, not houses. Her technical explanation cemented their belief in her madness. Thorne shook his head, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "You talk like your book. The mountain don't read. The cold don't care about your battery." He spat the word. "You've chosen your hill. Literally. We won't waste a rescue party on stubbornness." He turned and mounted his horse. The others followed, casting backward glances not of pity, but of finality. They had absolved themselves. That night, the temperature plunged, the clear sky allowing the day's feeble heat to flee into the star-dusted void. It was the first true test. Inside the kiva, Anika let her fire die to embers. She lay on her raised platform, Kip a warm weight against her legs. The silence was absolute, a thick velvet hush. The cold, which in the shack would have been a sharp, invading presence, here was a gentle, stable layer near the floor. Up on her platform, the air retained a residual warmth, radiated from the cob walls that had soaked up the day's sun and fire. She breathed deeply. The air smelled of clay and dried grass. Kip sighed in his sleep. The physics, on a small, peaceful scale, held firm. The community had issued its verdict, death by stubbornness. But inside the silent, earthen chamber, a different verdict was being written in stored BTUs and stabilized temperature. Anika had built her argument from the very substance of the ridge. And the mountain, gathering its breath for a historic and terrible rebuttal, would soon deliver a storm that tested every principle. The Christmas blizzard of 1879 was stirring in the Gulf of Alaska. beginning its long, destructive march toward the Rockies. The Christmas blizzard of 1879 did not simply arrive in the Rockies, it performed a siege. It began on December 23rd not with snow, but with an unnatural, humid warmth that made the remaining snow drip and the air feel thick. Old-timers in Argent's Hope looked north, their faces grim. A Chinook wind, Elias Thorne muttered at the saloon, bear's breath. It's sucking the cold down from the Arctic behind it. He was right. The warm wind died at dusk, replaced by a silence so profound it hurt the ears. Then, a deep, booming report echoed through the peaks, not thunder, but the sound of freezing air colliding with the warm valley. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in an hour. And then the snow came. It was not gentle flakes, but a hard, granular ice that fell with a furious, hissing insistence, driven by a wind that screamed down from the passes with the voice of a deranged giant. Inside her kiva, Annika heard the change. The initial warm wind had whispered across her sod roof. Then the silence. Then the hiss. The hiss quickly became a roar, a sustained, bass note of fury. Yet, within her circular wall, the change was subtle. The roar was muted to a deep, muffled rumble, as if the storm were happening several mountains over. Not a single draft fingered its way through the monolithic cob. She lit her oil lamp. The flame burned straight and true, untouched by the chaos outside. Kip lifted his head, ears swiveling, but he did not pace or whine. He resettled with a grunt, his nose on his paws, watching her. He was not afraid. The sanctuary held. The same could not be said for Argent's Hope. The first sign of the town's distress was a sound that cut through the storm's roar. A long, agonized groan of timber, followed by a splintering crash. A roof, overloaded with wind-driven snow, had failed. Then came another sound, the frantic, irregular clanging of the church bell. A call for help that was swallowed by the wind after 3 desperate peals. Annika stoked her small fire, trying to ignore the implications. She had prepared. They had mocked. This was not her consequence to bear. But the storm was an impartial auditor. An hour later, a new sound joined the symphony of destruction, a high, desperate whinnying of a horse, terribly close, and a man's voice, shredded by wind and fear, shouting,
"Whoa, whoa, easy!"
There was a terrible third scramble, and then a pounding, not on her door, but against the hillside near her entrance tunnel. Wrapping herself in a besom robe, she crept to the tunnel mouth and pulled aside the inner hide curtain. A shape loomed in the white void, a man half dragging a limping horse. It was young Liam, the livery boy, his face a mask of ice, his eyes wide with animal panic. His horse had bolted from town, and he'd been thrown, his foot caught in a stirrup before the animal stumbled to a stop here of all places.
"Liam!" she shouted over the wind. "In here!"
He didn't question, didn't seem to even recognize her. Survival instinct alone drove him to lunge toward her voice. He stumbled into the tunnel, pulling the frantic horse partway in before the beast balked at the darkness. Annika helped him unhook his frozen foot. Then they shoved the horse back out into a small, relatively sheltered alcove she'd formed with a wood pile. Inside the kiva, Liam collapsed on the earth floor, gasping. He stared around, his breath clouding in the lamplight. He saw the smooth, curved walls. He felt the still, cool air. He saw Kip calm and alert. He saw Annika, moving to get him a cup of water, her face not etched with terror, but with focused concern. The contrast between the hell outside and this profound, silent pocket of stability was a physical shock. The boarding house roof, it caved in the middle. He stammered, his teeth chattering. The mercantile's front window blew in, snow it's filling the streets like a river. Before Annika could respond, another sound came, a frantic, two-fisted hammering on the timber frame of her entrance tunnel. And broken Lime.
"Boy, are you in there?"
In Gaius Thorne, Annika pulled the hide aside again. Thorne stood there, a colossal, ice-encrusted statue, barely recognizable. He held a rope tied around his waist. The other end vanished into the white murk, leading to a knot of other figures. Mrs. Gunderson, Higgins the carpenter, a few others, all huddled together, being slowly buried where they stood. "He's here," Annika said, and stood aside. Thorne shoved Liam's horse further into the shelter of the woodpile, then dragged himself and the others inside. They stumbled into the kiva, a procession of the damned. Their clothes were sheets of ice. Mrs. Gunderson's hair was frozen to her cheeks. Higgins had lost a glove, and his hand was a waxy white claw. They fell into the space, their frozen bodies shaking the earth floor. Then they grew still, stunned into silence by what they sensed. The roar was gone. The killing wind was gone. The air, while cool, was still and breathable. The lamp flame was steady, and it was warm. Not fireplace warm, but a deep, radiant, ambient warmth that emanated from the very walls. It was the warmth of captured autumn sun and guarded body heat, released slowly from the thermal mass of the cob. Thorn's eyes, red-rimmed and frost-lashed, scanned the room. He saw the thick, sculpted walls, seamless and strong. He saw the dry floor, the intact roof. He saw the small, efficient fire in the hearth, a fraction of the size needed to heat his own cabin. He saw the girl, the mud girl, moving to help Mrs. Gunderson out of her frozen coat, her actions efficient, capable, in control. The understanding did not dawn. It crashed over him like an avalanche. His mockery, his certainty, his ultimatums, they weren't just wrong. They were a fundamental failure of perception. He had seen dirt. She had seen a battery. He had seen a hole. She had built a sanctuary. The storm had audited both their understandings, and his had been bankrupt. A low, involuntary groan escaped him, the sound of a worldview breaking. He didn't look at Anika. He looked at the wall, his gaze tracing the gentle curve, the subtle imprints of her hands in the cob. The evidence was all around him, speaking in the quiet language of physics. The insulating air gaps in the straw, the heat, retaining mass of the clay, the brilliant, simple logic of sinking into the Earth's own constant temperature. Others came as the blizzard raged for 2 days. A miner with frostbitten feet crawled in. A mother with 2 small children, their cabin's chimney collapsed, found her way, guided by the faint, blessed column of smoke from Anika's chimney pipe, the only one still flowing in Argent's hope. The kiva, built for 1, sheltered 13. The air grew close, but the cob walls absorbed the humidity. The single hearth, fed sparingly, was enough. People slept sitting up, leaning against the warm walls, their breath a collective cloud in the lamplight. They were alive. Elias Thorne sat in the place Anika indicated, accepting a cup of melted snow. He was no longer the authority. He was a refugee in the house of mud he had condemned. His great, work-calloused hands trembled around the tin cup, not from cold, but from the sheer, humbling force of the truth that surrounded him, holding him and his people safe. The blizzard blew itself out on the morning of December 26th, leaving a world erased and reborn in blinding white. The survivors emerged from the kiva one by one, squinting against the painful glare. Where Argent's hope had been, only misshapen white mounds and the jagged, dark teeth of broken timbers showed. The church bell hung silent, its tower buried to the eaves. But on the ridge, Anika's grassy, snow-dusted dome sat intact, a deliberate, enduring fact against the devastation. The walk down to the settlement was a silent procession. They waded through drifts that buried cabins to their rooftops. Elias Thorne's sturdy home was a collapsed ruin, its contents frozen into a tangled sculpture. The boarding house had been halved by a fallen pine. The mercantile was a glittering cave of ice. The storm, in its savage audit, had found every flaw in their conventional wisdom. Only the borrowed, ancient logic of the kiva had balanced the books. In the harsh week that followed, as the community dug for its dead and salvaged what it could, a quiet transformation took root. It began with Elias Thorne. The bluster and certainty were gone, scoured away by the wind and the humbling silence of the cob walls. He did not offer Anika apology. He offered his labor. He came to the ridge. His manner changed. It is solid. No cracks. The straw binds it, Anika explained, running a hand over the cold, hard surface. It dries slowly, evenly. It moves as one piece with the frost. He nodded, absorbing the lesson. He helped her reinforce the entrance tunnel. He brought up a share of the major salvage supplies, flour, coffee, a ham, and placed them inside her kiva without a word. It was in tribute. Others, seeing the once unassailable Thorne deferring to the mud girl, let their own scorn dissolve into a desperate, hungry curiosity. Anika's great-grandfather's journal ceased to be a book of madness and became a blueprint for survival. Thorne, who could cipher minor essays but not complex prose, asked her to read the kiva passage aloud. He had her teach him the cob mix ratios, 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part straw, and the importance of a thick, monolithic wall for thermal mass. When the thaw finally allowed, it was Thorne who led the rebuilding effort, not as he had before, but anew. The new community hall was built into a south-facing slope. Its rear wall was molded from cob, thick and curving, bermed with earth. Its roof was sod over timber. It was a hybrid, a marriage of the familiar to the brilliant, proven truth of the ridge. Anika never sought the spotlight, but her knowledge, once the currency of ridicule, became essential. A woman would ask how to shape a sleeping niche to capture radiant warmth. A prospector would inquire about orienting a root cellar. She showed them how to see the earth not as something to dominate, but as a source of shelter, a partner in earth sheltering. 143 years later, the wind still sighs through the Colorado Rockies. but it whispers past ski lifts and the solar panels of mountain homes. The Ross claim is a small, fenced historical preserve, a grassy knoll overlooking a modern resort town. Inside a meticulously reconstructed kiva at the Living History Innovations of Survival Museum, a climate control system hums softly. A park ranger addresses a group of high school students. "This isn't just a mud hut," she says, her voice echoing slightly in the circular space. "It's a precise application of passive solar principles in material science." Anika Ross was 17. With no formal training, she applied Andean wisdom to a Colorado winter. Her understanding of thermal mass and insulation in the Christmas blizzard of 1879 didn't just save 13 lives, it fundamentally changed the architectural resilience of an entire mining community. Outside the exhibit, displayed under glass, is Alonzo's journal, open to the kiva entry. Next to it, on a simple plaque, is the line Anika had copied into her own journal years later, the words that traveled from the Andes to a ridge and into the future. "Some ideas are too good to die with the people who have them." The grass on the original ridge grows thick and green, concealing the specific contours of the excavation. But the idea itself remains exposed, a monument not to stubbornness, but to the profound, enduring power of listening to the whispers of the earth and having the courage to build a sanctuary from them.